we're going to talk about installing crown molding. Crown molding is made to be installed in a certain position usually. Okay, there are cove molds and things that could be installed in either direction, but this particular crown is meant to be installed like this, not like this. It just looks wrong when it's installed upside down. But that's the way most DIYers end up installing it because they don't know how to cut it. It'll be on the wrong angle, which means it'll protrude farther out on the ceiling than it does down on the wall. So that's the way it's meant to be installed. There's a lot of saws that are made now that are compound miter saws that allow you to cut both angles at the same time with the molding laying flat. That's wonderful for a perfect world, but we're not in a perfect world. Corners aren't exactly 90 degrees, and so it ends up being off just a little bit. So I prefer to cut my moldings the old-fashioned way on just a single angle miter saw, and then I cope them. Okay? A lot of people won't cope moldings. They try and fit them together using a couple of miters, and I've just seen a lot of really bad mitered crown molding. So I decided to experiment one day and see if I could cope it, just like you would baseboard. And what I found out is that, yeah, it's a little bit tougher, but it can be done. So I'm going to demonstrate how to do that. I just want you to look over here. This shows crown molding, and it's going to be installed up against the ceiling, which is right here, and these are the walls. Okay, so this is upside down. But when you cut crown molding, you have to cut it upside down. If I was going to cut a miter, the miter would appear as I look straight up at the molding. So that's my miter, and I have to cut it in that position. So how do I do that? It's impossible to cut the molding with it standing up like this. We need to, or to cut it like this. Okay, that's just impossible. It needs to be firmly against the fence and the table. And if I try and do it like this, I'm going to get the wrong angle. That's what most people do wrong. They bring it over to the saw and they set the molding like this, as though, you know, looking at it this direction is the proper direction. But when we're cutting it, we need to use the table of the saw as the ceiling and the fence as the wall. So we're actually holding the molding upside down on the miter saw. And we're going to tip that to the right angle just by watching the gap over here. You notice as I raise and lower that, it opens and closes that gap. Okay, once I get it to the right angle, that gap is going to be closed. And then I can just mark a line here along the base of my miter saw. As you look at a profile of the crown molding, you notice on the back side it's not square. Okay, it's cut on angles, and those match the wall and the ceiling. Okay, so this is the side that goes against the wall, this is the side that goes against the ceiling. What you can see here is I've just set up a jig to help hold the molding while I cut it. Now I have, at times when I've had a different size molding and didn't want to take time to adjust the fence, I just hold it, okay? But you have to have a really steady hand. The molding can't move at all while you're cutting it or it won't fit. So this allows you to just slide it right down. You notice that gap on the top closed, so it's at the right angle. This allows me to slide the molding down tight against this jig and put a lot of pressure on it and almost guarantee that it's not going to move. I chose to make this jig for cutting crown out of plexiglass so that I could see through it and see exactly what angle I'm setting my saw at. I've used others before. This is one that I used to have, and you can see it's cut up pretty good, but I just clamped it to the saw with a couple of C-clamps instead of putting screws and actually screwing it to the base. This is great if you're doing a lot of the same thing. This is a little bit more flexible because I can move it wherever I need to. So I'm going to just do that. I've got the saw turned to 45 degrees. Now remember, if it's a 90-degree corner, 45 degrees works. If it's anything other than 90, you have to adjust the saw a little bit. Okay, I've just trimmed that to get rid of the last cut, and you notice that I've exposed the profile that I need to cut along, just like when you're cutting any other molding like baseboard. I've back mitered that so that I expose that edge. I'm going to mark it with a pencil just like I would for any other molding so that I can see that edge a little bit better when I go to cope it. Now, what I have here is just a little jig that I made, and you have to picture this as though it were the wall, and I've just screwed a couple of scraps to it so that it will hold my molding while I make my cut. I tried the very first time I tried this, I tried to do it without a jig to hold it. It can be done, but it's painful. So just throw a couple of scraps together to hold the molding for you, and then come over to your bench. And we're going to start making our cuts. Notice I'm undercutting just a little bit. Now, what you have to be careful of here is if I tip my saw too much this direction, my saw will actually cut through the face of my molding. So I have to keep it fairly straight up and down as I approach that edge right here. Okay. I'm going to come down here. This cut right here needs to be straight across. It needs to be 90 degrees right from where the molding turns around the corner and goes horizontal. Okay. So I'm going to put it back in my jig. I'm going to hold that and just cut that square, no undercut. And then I'm going to come back and start undercutting with all the rest of my cuts. Okay, so there's just a slight radius there on the corner. I'm actually going to try and keep that to make it fit really tight. Really easy to cut that off. Cut a little too far and get rid of it. So you have to be really gentle. Okay, now you notice I'm still undercutting. Even as I go around that radius, I'm undercutting to make sure that the good edge protrudes out a little bit farther. I'm cutting through about twice the amount of material that I would be if I was doing baseboard, so it's going to go about half as fast. You just have to be patient. Okay, come in from the other direction. Still undercutting. Get right up to the line without going over. Okay, this is where you have to just be gentle, let the saw do the work. If you try and force it, with the blade in backwards, it's going to bend the blade and it'll break it. Get right over to the edge of that line. Right now, this the waste material is actually pretty helpful. If you can keep it there and there's anything that needs to be trimmed a little bit more, it'll hold your blade right where it needs to be while you trim it. As soon as it's gone, then you don't have anything to hold it. This is where you have to be really careful about how much you undercut. You need to undercut, but if you undercut too far, you'll actually cut through the front of the material. So just be careful. Okay, I'm going to back up a little bit. Take a little bit more off. I'm widening my kerf a little bit, trying to straighten up my saw a little bit so I'm not undercutting quite as much as I come around that corner. Now I'm going to take my rasp and just clean up a little bit. Remember, only cut on the downstroke. Don't try and pull it backwards because it'll splinter. And just like with my saw, I'm undercutting as I go around the corner. A little bit right there that I didn't get enough of. Okay, the rasp is really slow. The saw is really fast in comparison. So you want to make sure that you get as much as you can with the saw so that you don't have to do much with the rasp. And by undercutting, it makes it so that you don't have to remove very much material from that front edge to make it fit. Okay, I'm going to just touch this up slightly. Get quite close enough with the saw, and that does take a long time with the rasp. I'm going to just get a little bit more with my saw. Okay, so once you've got that fine-tuned with your rasp, it should be ready to install. So when you fit those in place in a corner, they should fit together really nicely. A lot of times we need to cut outside corners for crown molding. This might be to go around cabinets, around a fireplace, mantle that's furred out a little bit. A lot of different places where you might need to do this. Really the only trick is to make sure that you're cutting it at the right angle and that both pieces of molding are being cut equally, okay? You can't cut one at 45 degrees and another one at 47 degrees because they won't match. So we're going to show you how to cut this. We've already determined that this wall is out of square. We need to cut it at about 47 degrees. Remember, when this is installed, it needs to be in this position, but we can't cut it in that position because it's just too wobbly. So we have to flip it over. Remember, this is still the wall, This is the ceiling. So I've got this set at 47 degrees. Put my molding in place. I'm going to turn it the other direction. Okay, so you can see why I use plexiglass for my jig, so that I can actually see how to set the saw. Take our other piece, cut it at the same angle. I take my two pieces back to my wall. And if I've cut those at the same angle, we should get a good joint. I'm going to show you what happens if they're not cut at exactly the same angle. Now you might install one piece of molding and then decide that you're going to fit the other one to it, but if they're not the same angle exactly, they'll never fit, okay? This one has been cut at 45 degrees, this was cut at 47 degrees. And you notice the bigger the angle, the longer the distance between these 2 points becomes. So they'll never fit. This one's always going to protrude out beyond the other piece because that distance is longer.